You just had a show on the Ukraine counteroffensive. So can you share your thoughts on that?
It's striking to me how propaganda repeats itself. It's one of the things that first alarmed me about Russiagate was it sounded a lot to me like the McCarthy era, where we were all now looking again for who in the United States was a disloyal Kremlin agent. And that was the first thing that alerted me to it and to how it could be used in these nefarious ways. And the same is true of this kind of vaunted counteroffensive we're told is about to change the war in Ukraine forever, because it reminds me a lot of in 2006 and 2007 when public opinion really started turning against the war in Iraq. The Democrats had won this huge victory in the midterm elections. That was when Nancy Pelosi first became House Speaker based on anger over the Iraq war. And we were promised by people like Bill Kristol and the neocons that this is going to be a war we were going to win in 2 months. And instead, we were in our 4th year and there was no end in sight. It was getting bloodier and deadlier and seemingly more difficult to win, not getting closer to win. And they created this kind of theory with a very arousal driven name called the Surge, that was actually nothing more than just sending more soldiers back into the war zone. And they were supposedly going to be trained in counterinsurgency. And this, we were told, is the thing that was going to change the war forever. It was going to be led by David Petraeus, this brilliant young general. And for a while it worked. It actually did help public opinion, but the surge was a total disaster for the same reason the war efforts in Iraq always were, which is you cannot defeat that kind of an insurgency in their own country. And if you look at the very people who were behind it, you know, people like David Petraeus and Max Boot and Bill Kristol and David Frum and Ann Applebaum and like the whole list of warmongers and neocons that dominated that era of politics back then, they're exactly the same people who are now telling us, as polling shows, that Americans are increasingly growing weary of the war in Ukraine that also has no end in sight. You don't have to worry because there's this thing coming called the counteroffensive that is going to reverse the losses the Ukrainians have suffered, take back the parts of eastern Ukraine where the Russians are very dug in. And it's very obviously similar rhetorically and in terms of propaganda, up to the point that it's the same exact people saying the same exact things. And we're already now hearing, even from places like CNN and inside the U.S. government that are extraordinarily, loyal boosters of the war effort in Ukraine, that the counteroffensive is already starting to fail by every metric. It was amazing. We heard in the first week, the Ukrainians, their big victory was they took 8 villages. I mean, the Ukrainians need to take cities and provinces, not villages. And the 8th village that the New York Times touted, the name of it in Ukrainian literally translates to 5 homes. And, the problem is the Russian army is very competent. They've learned from their mistakes. They're very, very dug in these trench positions in eastern Ukraine with a huge front line that is going to be very difficult to breach. And even if they can, it's going to take more than a year, if not longer, another $100 billion from the United States and Western European allies. And the question becomes, what is worth incurring the risk of escalation of a world war, even a nuclear war? Joe Biden himself says we're closer to nuclear Armageddon than any point since 1962 from this war. And I think when you look at the people who are behind the main propaganda, who are the main boosters, it should raise a lot of skepticism.
Right. Something that's so interesting, and you talked about this earlier, is people's empathy for Ukrainians, which is, I mean, I think a lot of people note the hypocrisy and the double standards, but there's of course nothing wrong with empathy. But something that I guess surprises me and I want to ask you about is how little that empathy translates into a desire for a ceasefire or diplomacy or negotiation. And you'd think that if people care about Ukrainian lives, they care about that. Why do you think that hasn't translated into that?
War propaganda is very effective because it has been studied for decades. It's a science and it plays on our best emotions, So when we hear, there are these feisty Ukrainians that just long for freedom and democracy and we're there to help and protect them, which, by the way, is exactly how the Iraq war was sold. They're Iraqis. They want to be free of Saddam Hussein. The Libyans want to be free of Muammar Gaddafi. Syrians want to be free of the oppression of Bashar al-Assad. And there's even some truth to it. So they use kind of a grain of truth and play on our emotions when the reality, of course, is that we're not there. That war is not protecting Ukrainians. That war is killing Ukrainians and destroying Ukraine. So to the extent that we have empathy for Ukrainians, and of course we should, they're human beings like everybody else, This empathy is being exploited and misdirected to a war that is actually destroying that country. The people paying the biggest cost by far to this war are not Russians, are not Americans, are not Europeans, even though they're all paying a cost. It's Ukrainians. And as you say, that empathy that I do have for Ukrainians, Ukrainian civilians have done nothing wrong, leads me to want an end to this war, not the ongoing continuation and fueling and escalation of this war, because in war, those are the people who are going to be dying. These Ukrainians, Zelensky is fighting with a conscript army, not a volunteer army. A lot of them have been arrested trying to flee Ukraine because they know they're being used as cannon fodder. You're talking about 20, 19-year-old, 23-year-old Ukrainian kids. And this war is as horrible as every other war. And if Ukraine care about Ukrainians, you should be really angry that not only has the Biden administration does nothing to solve this war, it's deliberately and overtly blocked diplomatic efforts to try and end this war because it wants this war to continue as a means of weakening
Right.
Russia.